how we deal with relationship issues is really important in our Christian walk and in life in general. All of us get offended, and all of us have offended somebody. Well, in today's video, we're going to talk about how to deal with some of those issues. Hello everybody, this is Pastor Lyle and welcome to Daily Renewal. If this is your first time tuning in with us, just want to ask you to consider becoming a subscriber to the channel. If you're getting value from our content, the best thing you can do that would help us is for you to like and share these videos with anybody that you believe that they will help. We've got over 200 different episodes of Daily Renewal that are all designed to help you in your Christian walk. You ever found yourself in a position where you feel like you've given out from your life, you've helped people only to get stabbed in the back? Or maybe you're somebody who you find yourself in a position where maybe you've wronged somebody and they have a hard time forgiving you because of something that you actually did. Or maybe you're like a third person, somebody who's friends with both of these types of people, and you want to see everything you want to do everything you can to try and see reconciliation between two people that you really care about. Well, today we're going to continue our study on what I will refer to as the fourth book that we're studying on the prison epistles of Paul. Now, I want to encourage you to go back and take a look at some of these other messages that we did on the prison epistles. And when I came up with these messages, I really felt like, there's a difference. When you're in a position where you think that this could be the last time you talk to somebody, or possibly, by faith you hope it's not, but when you're in prison, there's a lot of things that go through your head, and I'm assuming. And, when Paul wrote these, I think he really wanted to establish some of the things that were really important to the faith. And so it's with that in mind that we take a look at the book of Philemon today. And this particular book was interesting in a lot of ways. It was one of the shorter books in the New Testament. And yet as we read it, we can see here that Paul is doing everything he can to make sure that his relationships are in order. And, my hope is that today you're going to see some things even in your own relationships that you'll be challenged by, and that through this you'll be able to see the importance of us playing a role in cultivating really healthy relationships. Now, one of the things that is so different about this particular letter that Paul wrote, he was often writing to churches, and he would often refer to himself as the apostle of God, or God's apostle. But in this particular letter, he was writing this to a person, a good friend, and he doesn't even refer to himself as an apostle. But there's a situation that is going on here that Paul really feels that he needs to take care of. And so he starts off writing this particular letter to his friend Philemon. I believe that's how it's pronounced. And he instructs that, even though I'm writing it to you, share this with the people in your family and share this with the church that's meeting in your house. So he's looking at Philemon here as being a church leader, possibly even a pastor, a house pastor. And he says this, starting in verse 4. He says, "I thank my God, making mention of you always in my prayers, hearing of your love and faith, which you have toward the Lord Jesus and toward all the saints, that the sharing of your faith may become effective by the acknowledgement of every good thing which is in you, in Christ Jesus. For we have great joy and consolation in your love, because the hearts of the saints have been refreshed by you, brother." And so we see here that Paul, in speaking to his friend, he's encouraging him and reminding him of just how important not only is this relationship that he has with him, but he's encouraging him and saying, here's Paul in prison. And everybody knew why Paul was in prison. He was in prison because he believed in the gospel message. He was in prison because he was preaching that message. So he's talking to his friend his friend Philemon here. And he says, you know what? You're doing a great job, man. And I just want to encourage you. I want to thank you for being who you are. And I don't want it to go unnoticed by anyone else around you, anybody else that's reading this, that my friend Philemon is a real encouragement to everybody around him. And he talks about the fact that, you know what, he's given his life as well. He's been generous. And, I think it's really important to understand that there is times where we can honor people. And I've talked about this before in Daily Renewal. In the Western church today, often we can take it too far where we honor man more than we honor God. But, in this particular relationship, Paul was really clear to just say, look, I just want you to know you're doing a really good job and your friendship is really important to me and what you're doing is making a difference. And it's with that he brings up the next part of the conversation, which is really the crux of why Paul was even writing this letter. So Paul goes on in verse 8. He says, therefore, in other words, because of the evidence I've seen of you as a believer and my friendship with you, I know you so well. Because of that, in verse 8, he says, therefore, though I might be very bold in Christ to command you what is fitting, because of his stature as an apostle, he says, yet for love's sake, I rather appeal to you, being such a one as Paul the aged, and now also a prisoner of Christ. So he's saying here, he says, you know what, I'm not going to sit here and try to mandate you or talk to you as an apostle, but I want to appeal to you. I want to appeal to who I know you are, the love that you have within you, because you're such a love-filled believer. He basically says, I got a favor to ask of you. And then he throws in, me, Paul, the aged one, the one that's been doing this for a while, and the one who's a prisoner to Christ. Now, notice he doesn't say a prisoner to the Romans. No, Paul totally understood that the things that he was going through, the physical prison that he was in, this is something that even though in the natural looked like a terrible thing, was something that he was able to embrace and understand that, what, God could get him out of this at any time. And the fact that he was still there, he took up the mantle and said, you know what? I'm a prisoner to Christ. I'm just doing what God's allowing to happen and embracing that. For whatever reason that is, might not understand it. Maybe you're there today, friend, where there's things happening in your life you may not understand. But understand this, that God knows where you're at. He knows all your situations. And we have to become like Paul and be able to look at it as being a prisoner to Christ. If there's things happening in our lives, embrace them and know there might just be a reason that God can use your situation, as bad as it may look in the natural. Learn how to embrace it, because there might be something that God wants to do through you in that situation. So then he goes on and he's going to ask him for a favor. And the favor is very interesting. He says this in verse 10. He says, I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten while in my chains. Now, this guy Onesimus wasn't an actual physical blood-related son. As we're about to find out here, Onesimus was actually a slave to Philemon. And he decided, for whatever reason, whatever was going on. Here we've got Paul talking about how generous Philemon is. And as much as that was the case, there was a time here where his slave, Onesimus, decided he was going to take off. And in those days, slaves didn't just take off. Slaves were basically, they could be put to death for simple things in this day. But so he took his life into his own hands and he fled, most likely, obviously, to Rome, because he had met up with Paul. He says, I appeal to you for my son Onesimus. So there had been a life transformation that had happened in Onesimus. Somehow, as he was relating to Paul, somewhere along the line, maybe that gospel message that Paul preached, Onesimus was able to hear. And there was something that had happened in Onesimus' life. And so as a result, this relationship was being built with Paul by this runaway slave. And so he says about this Onesimus in verse 11, he says, who once was unprofitable to you, talking to Philemon, but now is profitable to you and me. He says, I'm sending him back. How profitable could he be if he's sending him back? Well, he wasn't sending him back because he wasn't profitable, as you're about to find out. He says, you therefore receive him that is my own heart, whom I wish to keep with me, that on your behalf he might minister to me in my chains for the gospel. But without your consent, I wanted to do nothing, that your good deed might not be by compulsion, as it were by voluntary. For perhaps he departed for a while, for this purpose, that you might receive him forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. Now, there's three things that I want to point out to you that are really important here. And again, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned, you've got three characters here. The first one, you've got Philemon. Now, Philemon, apparently a really good Christian man. Here he is doing his best to lead a church. And I can tell you right now that leading a church, it's a lot different than a lot of people think. Here you are, you're trying to teach people, and a lot of people have their own ideas, their own doctrines. So here we've got a guy who's given his life for people. And and just like happens to a lot of pastors, and I can speak for pastors, the longer you do this, the more opportunity you have for people to betray you. And people will betray you for a number of reasons. But in his case, it's established that Paul says, Philemon, you are doing a great job. You're a good pastor. You've given your life. You're generous. Your people really are blessed to have you as a leader. But that being the case, as much as Philemon seems to be a really good guy, there is a situation that has happened in his life where he's had a slave, somebody that was rightly his according to the law of the land. This was his slave, and this slave betrayed him. He ran away. And that brings us to the second person in the equation, Onesimus, who decided again to take his life into his own hands. He fled away from his rightful master of the day, and he fled to Rome, and he found himself in this position where he met Apostle Paul. And his life was dramatically transformed. But, deep in his own heart, he had to know that there was this, he couldn't just go back to Onesimus, or he didn't know if he could go back to Onesimus, or back to Philemon. So he's in a position where it's very awkward. And, I can remember times where, whether as a believer or non-believer, times when maybe you have wronged somebody, whether willfully or not. There's times where I look back and maybe look at different standards. People have different standards for things. There's been times where I've missed the mark with people, and it brings an awkwardness in the relationship to the point where I've had many times. I remember one guy years ago, before I was a Christian, we were kind of battling over the same girl, and that guy to this day still hasn't forgiven me. And it was because she was his girlfriend first. And you know what? I mean, I haven't talked to that girl in years either. But yeah, he's still in his own heart. He will not forgive me for that. But there's a part of me that just, that goes, if I could have any kind of reconciliation with that guy, and I've tried on many occasions, I would love to have that because he was a good friend. And some might say, well, you shouldn't have done such a dumb thing to begin with, whether it's your situation or mine. True enough, but often we find ourselves in situations where either people have perceived that we've wronged them, or we actually have wronged them, and there's a place in our heart where we want to reconcile. But let's face it, there's times where people do not want to reconcile. And Onesimus was in a position where he had legitimately wronged someone and had not seen that reconciliation come to pass. And then we've got the third guy. And that is Paul. And Paul, friends with both of them. One, he says, is like a son. And the other one he treats as a dear friend. And yet on the inside, there's this battle that's going on because he wants to see reconciliation. But I'm going to tell you that there's another thing that's going on here, and it's something I think we need to be very careful about. Now, part of the reason why I believe that Paul wrote this letter to Philemon was because his relationship to Philemon was really important to him, and it was so important that he didn't want some decisions that he made to possibly bring offense or a disunity to the friendship that he had with Philemon. Now, how did he do that? Well, often when you see, you get a triangle of three people, okay? You've got two that are offended with each other, or one that's offended with another, however you want to look at that. There's often, I've found myself in the middle where I'm friends with two people, but they're two people that, for whatever reason, don't get along with one another. And that can cause a strain on relationship. And one of the things that I've seen a lot in the church world today, I've seen many times where you've seen two pastors that are maybe really good friends with one another, and then all of a sudden there's a church member that doesn't like the church anymore. So they decide they're going to go to the church down the street, and it's the same church that the pastor of that church is friends with their former pastor. And I've seen that triangle absolutely explode to the point where the two pastors are no longer friends, or it rips relationships apart. And it's with that in mind that I want to give a really key point in relationships that Paul uses here. Now, the first thing that we see is Paul clearly states to his friend Philemon that he's met this guy Onesimus, and it's very clear he knows the situation. And in that day, if you harbored a slave, which you were allowed to do, the person that harbored the slave under Roman law, which was actually taken from a Greek law, they inherited it, you were allowed to bring in a slave that fled his master. But one of the stipulations was you had to do everything you could to try and bring reconciliation, or try to get that slave back to his master. And if the slave refused to do that, then you could bring that slave to open market and sell him and give the price that you got for that slave to that slave owner. Just a side note. So here he is, he's saying, the first thing you have to understand is he gets a hold of his friend and he says, hey, I want you to know that this guy that's betrayed you is with me. And this is really important, because the idea of communicating is really important if we want to keep our relationships in unity. Often, like I mentioned earlier, I've seen times where there's almost this sense of, when it comes to churches, when a person switches churches, often the pastors, I don't want to say anything. I'm just glad that this person's at my church. And if we're more excited about having somebody switch churches just so we can have more butts in our seats than we are about how we relate to one another, especially how church leaders relate to one another, then this could be this often comes up as being a real potential problem. I've been in my particular city for years, and I've seen this kind of stuff go on where, pastors have a hard time trusting one another. Number one, it can be because they are out of line and they look at their church as being theirs, and they got a hold of it like it's their own rather than God's church. But from there, there's often on the other side this idea of we really don't care what happens to the church or the pastor down the street. As long as I have revival, in my own heart, a lot of people, they won't admit this, and I have to admit there was times where this wasn't developed in my heart. Where I just, as long as our thing is going good, if it's at the expense of somebody else, who cares? It's all for the kingdom of God. Well, Paul here, he's got the idea of wanting to make sure that his friend is not hurt here. He doesn't want that relationship hurt. So he's informing him, hey, I know about this guy Onesimus, who apparently, I know now, was a slave of yours. I want you to know that I've got him here with me. That's the first indication. But he also lets him know just how valuable this guy is. Now, to Philemon, he's not very valuable right now at all. In fact, according to Roman tradition, if you do get him back, the Onesimus might not live long. He's so useless to me. But Paul's saying, this guy has become important. And if he's important to me, Philemon, you have to understand that he's important to the gospel. He says, talks about him being as a son to him. So he's telling his friend, there's been such a transformation in this guy who used to be your slave, this useless guy, Onesimus, that now understand that he's useful to me, he's useful to the gospel, and therefore he's now useful to you. And so he brings this up, the idea of Onesimus's life change. Now, the second thing that I want to point out that he did here, after pointing out how useful he is, he also hints that, you know what? He's so useful, I would really like to keep him with me. When you're in a situation where you feel like you've done something wrong, and we've all been there. The times where maybe people have called you down and tell you you're no good, tell you you're not going to amount to much. It really does mean something, when somebody will take that hurt, take that pain, and pour into your life to the point where they can restore that usefulness that you have. They restore the fact that you really are important. You really do mean something. You really do have worth. And that's one thing that I think is really important. I know for myself, before I was a Christian, if I was playing hockey and people were cheering, I thought that was good. But when all the cheering was gone and when nobody was there anymore, and my life was tied up in that. Maybe for you listening today, maybe your life is tied up in how in how you treat your family, and then you find out your family doesn't treat you well, or maybe your life is tied up in working at your job, and you find out that your job really doesn't care much about you. There's all sorts of things in our life that if we focus on, then we find out that really, as much as we poured in, we find out that it doesn't really mean as much to other people as maybe we thought that it should. And at times we can end up feeling like we've wasted time, or we feel useless. But when you got somebody else that comes along and pours into your life and says, you know what, not only are you useful, but here is Apostle Paul, somebody who's one of the key figures in the Christian faith. He says, you might not have been useful in days past, but me, I want to choose you. If I could choose anybody to help me, it's you, because you're doing that well at what God has called you to do. The great part about this is Paul actually had somebody like this in his life earlier, a guy named Barnabas. Nobody trusted that Paul was even a believer. They didn't want to talk to him because he was out persecuting Christians, and for all they knew, it was just a ploy for him to be able to get into their ranks and arrest them. But Barnabas took a chance on Saul, or Apostle Paul, and it made all the difference in the world. Well, here's Paul, trying to do the same with this guy Onesimus, and so Paul appeals to his friend and says, you know what, I am going to send him back to you. But that being the case, know this, that I could really use him. Now from there's something else that we have to see in the story. And it's this. We have to understand that Paul, if he was in the modern church today, he would be happy. He says, I got Onesimus and everything's going good, and we're just going to carry on as if nothing happened. But again, Paul thought that it was very important that he get the consent of his friend. It was really important, and I hear a lot of people say, you know what, I don't care what other people think. To a degree, that statement can be true. We don't want what people think to dissuade us from doing standing for our principles. But we also have to understand that we have to have relationships where we do care about what some of our brothers and sisters think. And so, Paul was establishing, I'd really love to have this guy with me. I'm going to send him back to you. If you got use for him, great. But understand this. I would really like to have him with me. But in order for him to be with me, I want to have your consent that it happen. And then from there, one of the other dynamics that we see from this is that Onesimus himself also had a dilemma, potentially. Now, I don't think Onesimus really did have a dilemma, but it could have in this aspect. he knew that there's a really good chance that he could go back to his former master. And like I mentioned earlier, according to what Romans believed, he could just go back and and Philemon just go, you know what, Onesimus, you ran away, off with your head, you're dead. I can get there's a lot of slaves I can get here, but you did me wrong, and now's my chance to get even. And he had every right to do so. But I think it's very important to understand that if a true believer, when you've wronged somebody, when the opportunity for reconciliation is available, and by the way, it's not always, you want to go back and make reconciliation. And, as I look at how Paul, I'm sure Paul would have talked with Onesimus about this. And, so the idea of sending him back, Paul's idea, he wanted to have Onesimus come back and serve him. But there was also something in him that saw the opportunity for two people that potentially had a problem with one another to have reconciliation. And I'm going to tell you that one of the greatest things that you can experience other than salvation itself, notice I said one of the greatest things, is when there's a relationship that has been absolutely destroyed, that somehow God can get into the hearts of a couple individuals and somehow bring them back together to the point where they are now stronger than they've ever been, the point where there is reconciliation. When the world sees those kind of things happen, that's a definite indication of a changed heart, something that man can't naturally do, but God can do. And so Paul is looking at this opportunity to see reconciliation happen between Onesimus and Philemon. And again, for this to happen, when we look at the character of Onesimus, Onesimus has to get to the point where he humbles himself to his former master. And I guarantee you that Onesimus didn't do what a lot of Christians in our time do today. I guarantee that Onesimus' plan didn't go like this. Well, I'm going to go there, and as soon as he finds himself at the feet of his own master, I guarantee that Onesimus did not look up at his master, or should I say, look eye to eye with his master and say, well, master, if I've ever done anything wrong to hurt you. I've heard that expression used so many times by people that have hurt people. And, here's what I've learned. That if I've hurt somebody, God will show me how I've hurt them if I simply humble myself, first of all, to God and ask Him. I remember a time years ago, working at a street mission. There was a guy that came into the mission, and he came in, and we had a very short conversation, and this guy blew up at me. And I had no idea. I was working there, and he was just a client that was coming in, a low-income guy. But I said something that absolutely offended this guy. And, so he left. And I went back into my office, and for 2 days, that night, I went home and I said, Lord, this guy's offended. I don't know what I said. And I really didn't know. But I was determined that I didn't want to, if I said something wrong to this guy, I wanted to repent. I don't care that if I was one of the bosses and he was a client or whatever. In my own heart, it hurt me that I hurt this guy so deeply, and I didn't know why. That night I prayed about it, and the Lord revealed two things to me that I said that deeply offended this man. And in my own heart, I went, you know what? It's not even that I said anything wrong, but the way that I said it, and in this, and for where he was at, he was very offended. And I saw that if I really was going to follow up on what God was trying to work in my heart, I needed to go humble myself to this man and apologize. Well, the next day or 2 days, I think it was, there was a couple days where he just didn't come in anymore because he said he wasn't coming in anymore. But there was a food bank down the street where they served coffee, and I had been asking, has anybody seen this guy? And they said, oh yeah, he's down at the food bank. So I walked down there, opened the door, and walked in, and when he saw me, I'll tell you, his face crinkled up, and he was angry. And I just said, hold it, stop. I said, before you get angry, I said, you're the reason I came here. I said, you know what? I was praying about what happened the other day, And before you say anything, let me just say, I need to apologize to you. And I said, I need to apologize to you, number one, for this, and I need to apologize to you, number two, for this. The fact that I knew what I was apologizing for, I'd sought the Lord. And that's the moral of the story here. If somebody's offended at you, ask God if there's something, what it was that offended them. And again, you might say, well, that wouldn't have offended me. Yeah, but you're not them. We need to seek relationship. And that's what we see here that Onesimus was going to be responsible for. And by doing that, I'm going to tell you that right off the bat, that guy, all of his defenses were down, and he ended up coming in and being a regular client, smiling his face when he came in. It absolutely transformed the relationship I had with this gentleman who absolutely hated me. Especially on YouTube, hey, there's always somebody that doesn't like what you say. There's always somebody that, and I find it interesting, a lot of times, people take it very personal. I've seen some people that, they got 20,000 views and somebody's mad, at them because they're talking about them and they're Joe Blow from nowhere. And it's just like, you know what? If he's got 20-some thousand people watching, I guarantee he's probably not singling out you if he's doesn't even know who you are. But, often we can take things personal. And so, this idea, again, of Onesimus having the responsibility to go and make things right. Now, I'm going to tell you, what helped Onesimus do this was the fact that he had somebody pouring into his life that was really, this is one of the factors that often helps, is having somebody that can encourage you to take care of relationships like this. Paul was taking a big chance here on Onesimus, but he was willing to say, before Onesimus went to Philemon, he was willing to send a letter to Philemon and say, hey, I just want you to know that I know what kind of guy this was before, but you know me, and he's coming back to you. And I'm going to tell you right now, I vouch for him. Hey, you're my friend. You know me. I am vouching for him. And when we've got people in our lives, people with character, people that are trusted people, if you're one of those people, you have to understand that we often are put into a role where we can potentially make or break somebody in some of their relationships. And I would say this, that we need to make the effort to do that more. There's people that have made mistakes. And if we can if we can play a role in seeing reconciliation between other people, we need to take up that role. We need to back people. We need to put our name on the line for people. But I also say this, I don't just put my name on the line for anybody. I used to have a long-standing rule. Back especially in the youth ministry days, I used to have a ton of people that would come in. And, we with our youth ministry, we used to have a couple hundred kids, and they would all work in the youth ministry. There was always things to do. I mean, there was opportunity to serve. And we purposely made that to help kids when they went out to find jobs. They had a bit of a work ethic. And I remember that the kids all knew that having my name on their reference was often a good thing because a lot of people in town knew me. And if they called and I gave them a good reference, I would pinpoint why they were good and why you should hire them. But the kids all knew that if you are going to come in and ask Pastor Lyle for a reference for work, he will give you an amazing reference. You'll get hired for sure. But he's not going to lie on the application form. In other words, he ain't going to give you a good reference if you didn't earn a good reference. And I think it's really important for us to understand that there's a lot of times when maybe you've wronged somebody and you want a pastor, or you want somebody to back you, and yet if there's no indication that there's a change in your life, if there's no indication there's a transformation going on, no indication that you're repentant, then why would they stand and put their name behind you in order to bring reconciliation for somebody else? The idea that Onesimus submitted himself to what we look at, or Paul refers to as a spiritual father, is absolutely key. And there's been a couple times in my life, I look back, my current spiritual father, The idea of having him in my life and being able to speak into my life. I've been a pastor for years and I'm a spiritual father to many, but I've seen the importance of having somebody be able to speak into my life, whether it's about doctrine, whether it's about things in my life, integrity, all those things. These are things that if we're going to truly move ahead in our walk and see things like reconciliation happen, we have to have other people in our life that can truly examine our lives and help us in seeing some of these processes occur in our lives. Now, Paul ends this with talking about the fact that he understands that there may be restitution in order. He says this in verse 17. He says, "If then you count me as a partner, receive him as you would me. But if he's wronged you or owes anything, put that on my account." We have to understand that this thing that Onesimus did, if we're really going to see reconciliation in our relationships, just like this relationship with Onesimus and Philemon, there may be a time where just saying you're sorry isn't enough. And restitution, if you've wronged somebody, maybe you need to, rather than just repent with words, maybe you need to restore if there was something that was taken, if something was destroyed, whether that's in the natural or even in the spiritual. I've come to learn this. I've had many people over my ministry career, if you want to call it career, I've found that I've been challenged on many times when people have come to me after betraying me and have said, I want you to forgive me and I want to be restored. And one of the things that was pointed out to me a long time ago, but one of the things that I'm actually really happy about in my own life is I can honestly say that I know that out of the many times that people have wronged me, and I'm sure you've had many times as well. I'm not trying to highlight that. But out of the many times where people have wronged me, anytime somebody has come to me and has truly desired reconciliation, and in some cases I've had people that have kind of done it a few times, anytime somebody has done what I really felt was a heartfelt attempt at reconciliation, not only was I quick to forgive, but I was also quick to try to find ways to help this person understand that everything was okay. And often, a lot of times, what I saw was those people, they wanted to make some kind of restitution. If somebody truly has a repentant heart, they want to make it up. There's something in them that says, I just want to show you that this is truly meaningful to me. And it's through that often the Lord uses that to make that relationship even stronger than it was the first time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's been times where there's been a couple people in my life where I've done this a couple times, and there's been a few that, very few, that I can honestly say it would take a lot more for that to happen now because they've gone through the cycle twice. I can think of one person, maybe they'd be on their third time. And it's a lot harder to do because it's indication if somebody continues doing these kind of things that would bring a breach in relationship, there's some transformation that still needs to happen. And that's an indication of something potentially broken in their relationship with God. Now, as much as we want to help, I also want to point out that as much as Onesimus was a willing participant, and Paul is trying to show that he'll vouch for him because he sees a change, this doesn't mean that you just receive anybody and just give full access, full reconciliation to somebody who's there's very evidence of any kind of change. Jesus, for example, did not have unforgiveness in his heart. But we see that not everybody has been forgiven to the point where they'll spend eternity with him. There is requirements for you to be able to have access to reconciliation through forgiveness. Now, again, if we have unforgiveness in our heart, another message for another day, we can't have bitterness and unforgiveness, but that doesn't mean that somebody can just come to you and say, I'm sorry, and you just treat it as if nothing happened. Well, I hope you're encouraged by that today. I hope you got something out of this message. Again, I just want to encourage you, if you are liking our content, feel free, share these videos with as many people as you think that they will help. I really enjoyed our session of Daily Renewal today, but until next time, God bless you and have a great day.